As we enter the second decade of the 21st century, the world is changing at an unprecedented pace. To a generation of adults who grew up in the 1990s, the dread of a nuclear holocaust has given way to a new set of fears. Terrorism, climate change, more recently, the global financial crisis. And as the threat of nuclear war has receded from the public mind, so has knowledge of the persistent dangers posed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the vast arsenals left over as a legacy of the Cold War.
I'm sure there are hundreds.
I have absolutely no idea about that. Really.
I couldn't say 1,000.
I'd say there are quite a lot that we don't know about, and some that we do.
About 30, 40, I don't know.
There are over 22,000 nuclear weapons in the world, the majority held by the United States and Russia. These range from so-called tactical nuclear weapons to H-bombs, with individual destructive power equal to over 3,000 times the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima.
Perhaps Kuwait and places like that, I don't know.
I would imagine Russia.
Afghanistan?
I don't know an exact list, no.
I suspect there's probably a lot more that I don't know about.
Many people know that the big five nuclear powers are the United States, Russia, China, Britain and France. Fewer realise that India, Pakistan and Israel each have over 50 nuclear weapons, that North Korea now has its own bomb, that Iran is close to acquiring the means to create one, and that other countries are waiting in the wings, eager to join what they perceive as an elite nuclear club of powerful states.
People have woken up to the fact that this is not conventional deterrence as we once knew it. It's a new world where everybody seems to want to get in on the act, and therefore we are all less secure.
I think a lot of people in the general public have begun to kind of think of this as a controversy that's over. It's not seen as a problem anymore. And I think few people have grasped that actually the scale, the extent to which it could be a problem again in the future.
If we look at the risks of the 21st century, the risk of nuclear catastrophe is one of the looming ones, and we are perhaps complacent about it because for the last 10 or 20 years it has seemed a diminishing threat, but is now an increasing one.
At the height of the Cold War, 25 or so years ago, it was rather like we were looking over the edge of a precipice, over the abyss, and there was some small risk that we tipped over. If we had tipped over, the results would have been utterly devastating. Now it's more of a slippery slope, the slippery slope towards a slowly nuclearizing world.
On the 5th of April 2009, US President Barack Obama made a speech in Prague, in which he spoke of the thousands of nuclear weapons left over as a dangerous legacy of the Cold War, and the mounting risks posed to the world by the uncontrolled spread of nuclear technology and materials.
With nuclear weapons, we're left with enormous numbers, thousands of nuclear weapons, tons and tons and tons of nuclear material that we no longer have any use for, that could cause equivalent global catastrophe to climate change. And we don't know how to deal with it. We just know we have to.
We're now moving to a situation where small states aspire to have nuclear weapons. Nuclear technology is freely available. Non-state actors, individuals, terrorists can get access to nuclear technology.
The more nuclear weapons there are, the more fissile material there is, the greater the risk that some of it might get into terrorist hands or the hands of rogue states.
I think there is a real risk of nuclear weapons, particularly frightening, dirty bombs, falling into the hands of terrorist organizations.
We have the problem of international terrorism. And the fact that we know that there are groups like Al-Qaeda who are looking for nuclear weapon materials and technology, and they will use it unhesitatingly for their nihilistic purposes.
During and since the Cold War, there have been many efforts to control the spread of nuclear weapons and avoid the risk of nuclear war through a series of international treaties stretching back to the 1960s. A milestone was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which came into force in 1970. In return for their commitment to reduce and eventually eliminate their own nuclear arsenals, the so-called P5 nuclear weapon states promised to pave the way for the development of peaceful uses of nuclear technology. But only if the non-nuclear weapon states promised not to seek to acquire a nuclear weapon capability of their own. Today, the NPT has 190 signatories and is generally acknowledged to have been successful in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. But over the past decade, it has been showing signs of falling apart.
It is now almost 40 years since it entered into force. It is the only treaty in which the nuclear weapon states multilaterally commit themselves to nuclear disarmament. So they must fulfill their bargain, and the non-nuclear weapon states must also fulfill their promises to remain non-nuclear.
It's come under pressure because there is a view among the non-nuclear weapon states that those of us who have nuclear weapons have not been living up to the bargain.
If your objective is to advance the cause of multilateral disarmament, it certainly is not assisted if, a bit like dragon's teeth, other nuclear states are springing up round about. And that's why the commitment of the 5 declared nuclear powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, is so important, because if they seem to be fulfilling their responsibilities under the treaty, if they seem to be genuinely concerned about multilateral disarmament, then that will operate as a very considerable brake on the nuclear aspirations of other countries.
The NPT is sustained on 3 pillars: the non-proliferation pillar, the disarmament pillar, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy was an incentive for the non-nuclear weapon states to move into the NPT, abandoning legally their nuclear option. But increasingly, with the problems of climate change, we find more and more countries now wanting to opt for nuclear energy. And that raises some alarms, because there is no firm firewall, as it were, between non-peaceful uses of nuclear energy and peaceful uses of nuclear energy.
In January 2007, the question of nuclear disarmament was thrust to the forefront of the international political stage, from the most unlikely of sources. 4 senior former US officials, George Shultz, William Perry, Sam Nunn and Henry Kissinger, wrote an open letter to the Wall Street Journal entitled "A World Free of Nuclear Weapons." Their letter warned of the increasing risks from nuclear materials and know-how falling into dangerous hands, and the growing threat of nuclear weapons spreading to countries that might wish to acquire them. They proclaimed an historic opportunity for the United States to lead the way in reducing these threats and ultimately to eliminate them altogether by embarking on a program of multilateral nuclear disarmament.
What has been unusual about the current interest is, if I can put it this way, it hasn't just come from the usual suspects. It's not just been people who for very many years have been calling for serious work towards reducing nuclear weapons, possibly abolishing nuclear weapons. It began with Dr. Kissinger, not exactly a peacenik in the public mind.
That call by those 4 Cold War warriors from the Democratic Party, from the Republican Party, has lent the idea of nuclear disarmament new urgency and credibility.
And then we have our own former Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett, who made a very important speech at the Carnegie Institute. I myself, as the Secretary of State for Defence, went to the conference on disarmament, the first ever Defence Minister to speak there.
And that has gone round the globe. We've seen similar statements by leading statesmen and women in the UK, in Japan, in France, in Italy.
Widespread support started to gather around the idea of nuclear disarmament internationally. Within a year, the new President of the United States declared in his inaugural speech his intention to confront the issue of nuclear weapons head-on. And then in Prague in April 2009, Barack Obama gave his landmark speech, in which he set out a blueprint for nuclear disarmament. He committed the United States to take the lead in cooperating with the rest of the world to a step-by-step dismantling and eventual elimination of global nuclear arsenals to zero.
To have a president who is as focused and as committed at such an early stage of his presidency as President Obama certainly creates opportunities that haven't existed for at least the last 10 years.
Momentum is gathering internationally to make the visions and the goals of the Wall Street letter and the Prague speech a reality. Leading experts and decision-makers worldwide are now making common cause behind President Obama's initiative.
Such is the opportunity which is presented here in 2010 by the arrival in the White House of someone with a commitment to multilateral disarmament, that there's an overwhelming need, you might even argue a responsibility, moral responsibility, for collective leadership.
Here in the UK, a top-level group of former Secretaries of State for Defence and Foreign Affairs and Chiefs of Defence Staff has formed to help push forward this agenda for disarmament and encourage others to do the same.
I think it's excellent that we have now got a higher level nuclear group of foreign secretaries, former foreign secretaries, defence ministers, former chiefs of defence staff. We can help because we are a nuclear power still. And I think something is happening in a different way in France and in Germany.
1 year on from his Prague speech, President Obama's initiative faces an important test. In May 2010, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty comes up for its 5-yearly review in New York.
Although the number of weapons in the world has reduced significantly since the end of the Cold War, there still are far too many of these. 95% of them in the hands of 2 countries, in Russia and the United States. So that bargain needs to be revitalised.
We need to make sure that we don't lose the opportunity of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that's taking place this year, because the whole issue of nuclear disarmament is not simply about nuclear weapons. It's about the proliferation of knowledge. It's about fissile material and how that is proliferated. It's about the security of civil nuclear power. And everyone has a responsibility in doing that.
A year later, as we approach the anniversary of the Prague speech, there's not a whole lot to show in terms of actual accomplishments.
He's up against some extremely powerful vested interests. There is a massive amount of funds invested in and profits being made from the arms industry.
You know, the reason that the world is blocked on taking further steps toward disarmament is because the issues are multifaceted and they're multidimensional and multinational. That is to say, there are more than one party, and there are usually more than 2 parties.
The hugely weakened Russian conventional forces compared with what they used to be, when set against the conventional capability of the United States, is one of those areas where, in terms of trust and confidence, there's going to be a real worry by some people, some influential people, I'm sure within Russia, who will consider it's important to maintain their nuclear capability while there's such a big imbalance between themselves and the main superpower in conventional terms. And that, of course, may well apply to other countries as well.
What we're dealing with here is a culture of mistrust. And it ratchets up. You notice it in a crisis. You know, one side makes an accusation, the other side defends itself and makes a counter-accusation, just like in family quarrels.
To many, the problems appear insurmountable. But what can ordinary people do to make a difference?
I guess if you feel strongly enough about it, demonstrating like my flatmate does. I don't know if that really gets anyone anywhere though.
I think what we really need is a generation who understand these things, who have integrity and who will themselves step up.
Writing letters and petitions.
Knowledge of our past history with nuclear weapons,
campaigning,
the power that they actually have, and you know, the fact that more people will begin to think about how they're a negative influence on the world.
Get knowledge, get involved with organisations that are attaining to educate everyone about what's going on.
We can make films like this.
Given my answers, finding out a few more details of the situation, so we're well armed to have those debates.
You can keep abreast of current developments and listen to informed opinion by going to websites such as the Top Level Group or Talkworks, the makers of this film.
We do all agree on the goal, and that is global zero, a nuclear weapon-free world.
There is no reason why, in a world of infinite possibilities, where there's political will, driven by an American president who's got new vision, we should not be able to see a world that does not need to rely on nuclear deterrence to keep the peace.
I sometimes think that the best definition of prophecy is simply prophecy is suggesting the possible. And what you have to do now is suggest all the positive possibles that can exist in such a way that you don't have to get a disaster before people take notice.
With all these new signs of a new attitude on the part of people of experience and knowledge and great influence, I do have some hope for the future. We have to have hope for the future, but I think now it is not unrealistic.
I think a future in which there's improved communication between people.
Yeah, a world in peace where countries aren't fighting with each other and they don't have to threaten.
The outdated posturing and power posturing between states is replaced by people having constructive dialogue.
I'd like to see the West take some responsibility and make the first steps of getting rid of some of their nuclear weapons. And yeah, just to see countries setting that example.
I would wish that people could live lives with hope. I think a greater understanding among peoples of different cultures, a greater culture of sharing and of caring for each other.
And I think we need to try and trust one another, not to attack one another, and not use them as a defence weapon.
In an ideal world, there'd be no such thing as nuclear weapons.
That sort of idea would be cool. They don't have weapons, they've got a peaceful outlook.
It will probably take lots of people of courage and bravery and determination.
Total disarmament, world peace. That's it.